Hi everyone, this is Mr. Thomas and this is the tutorial for plants and fungi. Now I want to point out right now that you can say fungi or fungi or fungi and they're all appropriate. But I'm going to say fungi because, the G, I like it to be is that a long G or a hard, I forget what it's called. But anyway, plants and fungi. You know what, I may end up saying fungi while I'm at it, so who knows, you know what I'm talking about, alright? The objective for this lesson is that you're going to compare and contrast the characteristics and biological processes of plants and fungus. So, when we say characteristics, we're talking about structures, we're talking about cell types, we're talking about shapes, that sort of thing. And when we say processes, we're talking about behavior. We're talking about things like, how does it get its food? What does it consume? How does it grow? That sort of thing. So we're looking at structures and behavior, basically. Now we're going to start with fungi. These are what you might consider mushrooms, but they have a much broader characteristic, or a much broader classification. Yeast falls into this category. Slime molds fall into this category. There's so many things that are in this category that aren't just your typical, mushroom. And there's tons of mushrooms. There's, here in Florida, we don't even have this. We've just got different looking mushrooms. And by the way, just so you know, they're all bad for you. Don't eat them. You may think that fungi are gross little organisms that cause nasty infections, and you're partly right. Oh yeah, you can get fungal infections, like underneath your fingernails and toenails, you can get a fungal infection. Athlete's foot is a fungus, and there's all kinds of things that go along with that. Some are harmful to humans, others are rather beneficial. We wouldn't have leavened bread if we didn't have fungus. Unicellular fungus, that means how many cells? Unicellular means they have what? One cell, okay? Unicellular fungus is called yeast. It's used to make bread. This is a multicellular fungus. It's called a mushroom. There's so much fungus that it's actually one of the major kingdoms. Remember, we have animal kingdom, plant kingdom, fungus, protista, monera, and remember that when we broke monera down into archaea and bacteria. So these are all the kingdoms. So we give fungus its own kingdom. Now you can imagine when it was first discovered, people probably thought it was a plant. So we're going to talk a little bit, and in fact at one point it was classified in the plant kingdom, but we're going to talk a little bit about how it is very different from a plant. So, and also from animals. In fact, believe it or not, they're closer to animals than they are plants. It's just that they are missing things like, instead of animals, they have cell walls, which makes them closer to a plant, but they don't photosynthesize, which makes them more like an animal. So these are just weird, different little things. Now, the fungi are eukaryotic. If you'll remember, that means they have a nucleus. The bacteria and the archaea kingdoms don't have a nucleus. They're very small cells. Everything else, the protist, fungus, plant, and animal kingdoms, are all eukaryotic and have much larger cells. And inside of those cells are all of those little organelles that we're going to get to soon. The yeast are unicellular, meaning they're only made of one cell, but they are a fungus. Fungi have cell walls, but unlike plants, plant walls are made out of the cell walls are made out of something slightly different in fungus, chitin and glucans, and cell walls of plants are made out of cellulose. So there's a difference there, right? In fact, chitin is the same stuff that makes up the shells in bugs. So it's another reason that they seem to be somewhat related to animals as well. Multicellular fungi are made of these thin microscopic filaments called hyphae. You might have actually seen this growing in dirt before, and if you dig up a plant, a lot of times you'll see this around the roots because this grows around the roots to help the plant. They live together. They increase and they cause this huge network called the mycelium network. This grows underground, and when you see a mushroom above the ground, there's a lot going on underneath the ground. These are incredibly small, incredibly thin, but they connect, and they actually connect to other fungus. And one of the largest animal organisms in the world, not animals, But one of the largest organisms in the world is this mycelium network that's growing in a forest somewhere in Europe, I think. The hyphae that make up the mycelium network, there are two types. There's the septate hyphae and the aseptate. When you see septate, you can almost think of separate, because that's really when I remember, that's the difference. There's a little divider here as this thing grows, and these are the divisions or the septum between cells. And each one of these is a different cell, and as it grows, it just keeps adding a cell, and it grows bigger and bigger and bigger. So every little branch off this is called a hyphae. But the aseptates don't go through the final stage of cytokinesis, and so they do a lot of mitosis, and they keep growing and adding a nucleus every so often. But essentially, this is kind of weird, it's just one big long cell, which is interesting. But they both perform basically the same function. It's just that some are separated into a bunch of smaller cells to create the structure, and then some are just one big long cell. And that's all you really need to know about that. So fungi are really weird in how they eat. They don't have chlorophyll in their cells, so they can't perform photosynthesis and make energy from sun, which means they're not a plant. And that's one of the major characteristics of a plant, is photosynthesis. So they rely on other sources of food, which makes them heterotrophic. Just to review here, hetero means other. You have heterosexual and homosexual. Well, heterosexual means other. Heterotrophic means other feeder. Trophic means feeder. So an autotroph, which is the opposite of this, would be like a plant. See, this fern right here is an autotroph. It has chlorophyll, which means it can make food from sunlight, and it's an autotroph. It can feed itself. But a fungus, like animals and a lot of other things, is a heterotroph, meaning it can't feed itself. It has to consume others for their energy and nutrients. And so as a result, you will find this thing absorbing energy from something else, in this case from this dead and rotting tree log. Okay, lots of nutrients still in there, and these organisms are basically decomposers that go in there and help break it down. The thing is that they don't have an internal digestive system. Everything is external. They do it with their hyphae and some other structures that release the enzymes and dissolve the food on the outside. In this case, this tree, the wood from this tree, and then pull them in through their mycelium network. So they're really an interesting thing. They just kind of sit, well, kind of like plants. They have the roots that pull in nutrients from the ground. By the way, just to be clear, plants do not get energy from the ground, but they pull in nutrients from the ground. And these things do the same thing, except they also pull in the energy. So, they're kind of like plants, kind of like animals, kind of like neither. And there are three types, depending on how they get their energy. The first type are the saprophytic. They feed on dead or decaying plants and animals. So you'll find them growing on dead logs. You'll find them growing on, you can find them growing on dead corpses of animals. One of the primary places you find them is on like cow poop, which is just dead plant material, right? They help in degrade the matter, such as the leaf debris or the animal carcass, and they're actually decomposers. A second type is called parasitic. Now, parasitic fungi, they feed on living plants and animals. This would be like athlete's foot, for example, and they inflict disease, and you can find this kind of stuff on humans and other plants and animals. There's the mutualistic fungi, which are really interesting because they help a plant that they're growing around. So you got plants, and then around the roots, usually it's called the mycorrhizae. Around the mycorrhizae, they grow and they share. The mushroom does something for the plant, and the plant does something for the mushroom, and it's called mutualistic. And of course, the root word there is mutual, which means together or share. So mutualistic fungi work together with other plants, and they probably could live without each other, but they do so much better working with each other. They share oxygen and carbon dioxide and sugar, that sort of thing. So it's a really great relationship. Basically what happens is the mushroom helps to break down nutrients and give it to the plant, and the plant in return gives the mushroom oxygen, sugar, support, sugar in the form of food. So it's a pretty great relationship. Now, reproduction of mushrooms is kind of weird because some of them, quite a bit of them, undergo asexual reproduction, which means it doesn't have to have two parents, just one parent, and it splits and becomes two. Yeast do this. We've studied in the past how cells grow and divide through mitosis, and that's exactly how yeast cells do it. They just grow and divide very rapidly. That's asexual reproduction. Another form of asexual reproduction is called budding, and there's not a good picture of budding here, but a small bump forms on the side of the growth. In this case, it's actually yeast, and there's just a little bump that grows on the side, and it turns into a whole other thing when it just kind of pinches off, and it happens very quickly. Fragmentation is another example. You get a piece of the fungal mycelium, usually you get a piece of the fungal mycelium and that fungus piece breaks apart, gets separated from the main body, and can grow and become a whole new fungus. It's just fragmentation, so it kind of fragments. So budding and fragmentation, and these are all asexual. They only require one parent. So they can also reproduce through spore formation, and this can be both sexual and asexual, and it just depends. Basically what happens is there's a fruiting body. This is what we generally think of as a mushroom, and out of it comes spores. Now those spores can just grow the way they are. They can just turn into more of the hyphae and the mycelium, right, and then turn back into another fruiting body, and then the cycle starts all over again. But on occasion, they can fuse with a hyphae of another fungi nearby, and as a result they can kind of swap DNA or combine DNA, kind of combine it. And remember, we can't have too much DNA or else we'll die, but they can kind of combine the DNA to get a full set of DNA, which then creates a whole new combination of DNA, or a whole new combination of genes to create a whole new organism. Remember, with asexual reproduction you get identically genetic offspring. With sexual reproduction you get a whole new combination. So mushrooms do both, and we talked about budding, we talked about fragmentation, but spore formation can be asexual or sexual. So here are some types of fungus or fungi. The first one are called the chytrids. They belong to a phylum. Remember, we go kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. In the kingdom of fungus, we have a phylum, or a group of fungus, called chytrids. They were the first type of fungi to appear, which means basically they're the simplest. They're the closest related to protists. Now, when we study evolution, we're going to see that we think that all animals, plants, and fungus evolved from protists. If you remember our last week's discussion, we had plant-like protists, animal-like protists, and fungus-like protists. Well, those are all protists, but the fungus-like protists turned into the fungus. These chytrids would be the first one to appear. They have a pot shape, and they can generally reproduce sexually or asexually, but they generally prefer asexual reproduction because it's faster. Some chytrids are saprophytic, while others are parasitic. Remember what those mean. And they live in aquatic environments in humid areas like swamps and bogs. Okay. The next one are the common molds. You see mold growing on your strawberries or your bread or a couple of things. They belong to the phylum Zygomycota. Common molds they're terrestrial, which means they live on land, and they exhibit all three types of nutrition. We had saprophytic, parasitic, and mutualistic. They produce both types of the hyphae, stolons and rhizoids. Stolons spread over the surface, while rhizoids go deep in the ground. So they produce both, which means they have the ability to do both, which means they can be more versatile in the way they eat. And when I say in the ground, I meant into the thing they're eating. I didn't mean to say into the ground. So over the surface of this strawberry, you've got the stolons, and then penetrating down into the strawberry, you've got the rhizoids. Whenever you see rhizoids, you should be thinking something that goes into, right? Here's a cross section on the side, I think, of a piece of bread. You got rhizoids going down into the bread, right? They reproduce sexually only if they can't reproduce asexually. So asexual reproduction, again, is easier, but if need to, they can reproduce sexually if it has to happen. They don't really have any divine genders, which means there's no male or female molds. They just have positive and negative mating strands, which basically means they have both male and female parts that can reproduce that way. The next one are the sac fungi. Don't know if you've ever seen one of these, like a puff mold or something out in the woods. Every once in a while you see a puff mold. They're kind of fun to stomp on. I wish I hadn't done it as a kid because the mold gets everywhere and makes a bunch more of these. And if you breathe it, it can cause you to be sick. But they belong to the phylum Ascomycota. Excuse me. They're also known as asmocytes. They have a sac-like structure that contains the ascosphere spores. Sorry, it's just the spores. They're what we call non-motile, which means they can't move, which is why they rely on something to compress the sac that then blows the spores out. Then they get spread around. They are seen in unicellular forms such as yeast. They reproduce asexually. They're seen in unicellular forms, but they grow multicellular forms to reproduce sexually. So they live in a varied range of habitats, and they do saprophytic, parasitic, and mutualistic growth. So don't just think puff molds. I mean, there's all kinds, but they all grow this kind of a sac. And then there's the club fungi. This is what we normally think of when we think of mushrooms. They're basidomycetes or basidomycota or mycota. They have the kind of the tall fruiting bodies. The spores are kept inside of the bodies. They generally reproduce sexually. They're multicellular and they live on the land. Pardon me. And they exhibit all three forms of nutrition: saprophytic, parasitic, and mutualistic. Now, what do you need to know about all these? Basically, I want you to know a couple of things. What is their basic body structure like? Are they multicellular or single cellular? Do they reproduce sexually or asexually or both? And how do they get their nutrition? Like these are saprophytic and parasitic. So go through if you want to make like a table, that would be a good thing to do. I don't know, the notes may have done it for you. So don't get too caught up in this. Just know what I should have added the phylum. So try to remember what phylum, and if you have it in your notes, then you're good, right? But this is going to help. And now we talk about the plants. See how easy the molds were, or the fungus was? No big deal. Now plants, you know what they are. I mean, there's all kinds of plants. There's little itty-bitty plants. Did you know there are plants that are so small you almost have to have a microscope, at least a magnifying glass, to see them? But they are plants. And then we get all the way up to the largest organism on Earth, which is a redwood tree living out in California. So plants are vital parts of an ecosystem. They are usually the producers in an ecosystem, which means they're the ones that absorbs the sunlight energy, turns it into food, and then everything else just kind of consumes from that. Practically, with the exception of the fungus that you eat, and I do enjoy my mushrooms and my yeast in my bread, but and mushrooms, unlike my pizza, and mushrooms with a piece of steak is like the best thing ever. But with the exception of those, and technically, now that I think about it, the energy from those mushrooms probably came from a plant. So even when I eat mushrooms, I'm eating what used to be a plant. Plants provide me with all of my energy. Every bit of energy I use came from photosynthesis in a plant. Practically, it's so hard to find energy in our diet that didn't come from plants that it's basically non-existent, right? Entire ecosystems thrive because of plants and other autotrophs. As a result, plants form the base of a food pyramid. You study the food pyramid. At the very bottom is always a producer, and in this case, we're talking about plants. Are there ecosystems that, you know what? And I need to add this because there are protists that provide a bottom part of the food pyramid too, and I'll bet you I've eaten food that has thrived off protists instead of plants, so I need to change that a little bit. But between plants and protists, every bit of energy on Earth that I'm using, every bit of biological energy, basically comes from photosynthesis found in either plants or protists, right? They also provide oxygen because they take carbon dioxide out of the air and use it during photosynthesis. The carbon stays inside of their bodies and they use it to build things like their structures or sugar. And then they just kind of throw the oxygen away because they don't need it anymore. And thank God, because I kind of like oxygen. Plants were present billions of years ago. So let's talk about how they evolved to form, or from simple prokaryotic organisms. So I want you to watch this video. It's 5 minutes long, but I'm not going to take the time to go over it. It covers a few things. It talks about how the early Earth was very different than it is now. It also talks about how life may have formed on the Earth all the way up to plants several billion years ago. It gives you what I think is actually a pretty good layout of how it might have happened. To be honest, and I love the way the guy said it, is there's a process that we just don't totally know, But based on all the evidence that we have so far scientifically, this is the best guess we have as to how life formed on Earth. And, it leads up ultimately to the formation of land plants. So it's a 5-minute video. Please watch it. The guy's really not a bad speaker, and it's not boring. It's only 5 minutes. You'll like it. Plus, it's stuff that we need to know for the future discussions that we're going to have. So anyway, it kind of talks about how things started really small and just slowly over time got bigger and bigger. And the way I see it is over time, and we're talking about millions of years over time, these organisms solved problems. Now, it was lucky. It wasn't like they were smart. They don't have a brain. It's just one day there was a genetic flip of the coin and a mutation occurred, and this one plant was like, whoa, look what I can do. But over time, slight changes in plant structure allowed for different things to happen. And when one of those things that happened became very successful, then oh my gosh, it took off like crazy. So we're going to start out with the non-vascular plants, because these non-vascular plants haven't solved a problem. And that problem is how do you move nutrients around a structure like a plant that doesn't have any kind of a circulatory system with a heart? Now, they do have cells, and cells can pass material from one to the other, and this happens in your body. Cells move oxygen from the capillaries to the cells, and then they go even further, and then waste is removed. So moving nutrition from one cell to the other is how these things work, and they're very small. These bryophytes are unbelievably small little plants. They do not have what we call vascular tissue inside of, as you'll see on the next slide. Big tall plants have basically kind of very thin straws that allow for the movement of nutrition to go all the way through them, kind of like you have blood vessels. These things don't, so they can't get very big, and so they only absorb nutrients through diffusion and osmosis, which is this process of materials moving around through the cells. Okay, they have to live in damp places. They have to be very small. They have very small root-like structures called rhizoids. There that is again. We talked about that in mushrooms. So think of rhizoids as just very small little kind of like, almost like hairs that stick out, whether it's in mushrooms or in plants, but it helps to anchor them like a plant would, and it helps to absorb water and nutrients from the soil. But these, and while these are plants, they're very, very small. They also represent the first plant life on Earth, the first land-based plant life. When I say on Earth, I mean on the land. And they were the only plant life on land for a long time, until one day a mutation occurred, and as a result, plants started to develop what we call vascular tissue. Now, vascular tissue are just big, long, thin straws that go through the middle of the plant, right up through here and then out through here. And if you think about it, it's just one big long, and it branches and then it branches again, but it carries nutrients through a process called transpiration, which the water and nutrients dissolved in the water will move up through the leaves and then the water evaporates out, and then more nutrients come up and go through it. It's a pretty crazy process. Now, there are two types of vascular plants. There are those without the seeds. Okay, so over here we've got non-vascular plants and all their stuff. Now we're going to come over here, and there's not really anything here I'm pointing at, but you can't even see that. Over here we have the non-vascular plants, a whole group of them here, and over here we have the vascular plants. And in those vascular plants, we're going to break it down into two groups. We got those with seeds and those without. Okay, now the first vascular plants didn't have seeds. Okay, these are what we call the pteridophytes. The pteridophytes are your things like your ferns. They grow in moist tropical regions. They can enter a dormant stage if there's not much water, and they can produce spores and without fertilization, which means they can reproduce asexually, which is kind of odd. You don't normally think of plants reproducing asexually, but they can. And they don't make seeds, they make spores. And there's a whole process called the alternation of generations we'll talk about. But it creates this sporophyte, which is a mature plant that releases these haploid spores that are underneath here. If you ever go look under a fern, you can see little kind of brown dots underneath. Those are the haploid spores. They then, in turn, the next generation, they get these things called gametophytes. So there's There's kind of like a asexual and a sexual process, and it's the alternation of generations, and you can get male and female gametes from the same tree. So they're kind of asexual, intersexual, and they have both genders. So it's just kind of weird. Now, the most recent kind of plants to form are the plants with seeds. There weren't any flowers until, this whole purpose of a flower is to attract a pollinator. And until there were bugs and things that lived on the land to pollinate, there weren't any flowers. You didn't need to have any flowers, right? And since the bugs didn't appear until well into the Jurassic, when you watch a movie like Jurassic Park, you probably won't see much flowers because, there weren't any bugs to pollinate. But scientists have classified these two types. There's two types of seed plants. There's the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. Okay. Now the angiosperms, they're the largest group of plants that we have because they're the most successful. Because being an angiosperm is the one where you have a flower, and a flower makes it where you are much more likely to spread your seed and become successful. So even though this is the most recent in terms of evolution, it's also the most successful, and that happens often. Okay. The angiosperms, they have a whole flowering process, and you've heard about the birds and the bees. The bee comes over, the bird comes over and brings the pollen to the plant, and then the pollen fertilizes the pistil and the stamen and all that stuff, and then it turns into a seed. Okay, and these are the seed-bearing plants, the angiosperms. All right, the gymnosperms. Gymnos means naked, right? Which we're going to get to, I guess, in just a second. So here's the cross-section of a plant, okay? And by the way, of a flower. And this is an angiosperm, and this produces a fruit. Now, it's one of my pet peeves is that tomatoes are fruits, not vegetables. What are you talking about? Fruits are sweet. No, they're not. Fruits are the result of a pollinated flower, okay? And that's just all there is to it. And so if you eat an orange, that was a pollinated flower. If you eat a grape, that was from a pollinated flower. But if you eat a tomato, that came from a pollinated flower. So did a cucumber, a squash, zucchini, green beans, these sorts of things. All results of pollinated flowers. So they're all fruits. Now what happens is you've got a couple of things going on here. You've got the anther, and if you click on this, it'll give you this. The anther is the male part of the flower. It produces the male gametes called pollen. Now I don't want to disgust you or anything, but the pollen is basically plant sperm. Okay, if you're allergic to pollen, guess what you're allergic to. And there are times of the year where plants are just having a grand old time. It's coming up here in the spring, and they will start releasing pollen into the air like you wouldn't believe. And the bees, and you can laugh at this all you want, the bees and the birds come in here, and down at the bottom is where the nectar is, so they have to crawl down in here to get the nectar to eat, which is good for them. But in the process of doing that, that's why these anthers are so spread out the way they are, the pollen gets all over their body. Then they fly to the next flower where they do the same thing, and in the process this is the stigma. The stigma is basically the female part of the flower, and this is where the piece of pollen gets to, and it'll travel down the style, and it'll travel down in here to the ovary, which contains the ovule, right? And that ovule is where the female egg is, even though it's not really an egg, but it's the female part of the sperm in the egg. Whatever, if the pollen is the sperm, then the plant has the ovule. Okay, and the pollen comes in here and it shares its genetic information with the ovule, and then that's the whole purpose of this entire structure. Okay, and then this starts to close up, and then it grows into a fruit where you get an apple or a pear or a tomato or a cucumber. And yes, they're all fruits, and if you don't believe me, look it up. Gymnosperms are a little different. They don't have flowers or fruits. Their seeds can be seen in their leaves or in their scaly bark. You've got your conifers, your cycads, and your ginkgos. Your conifers are like your pine trees. Pine trees are gymnosperms. They don't have flowers. Okay, they rely on wind and other types of situations like that to spread their pollen around. Okay. That's why pine trees, man, they produce a lot of pollen. It is actually less effective than the angiosperms and the bees and the birds, which is why the angiosperms are more successful than the gymnosperms, right? The male reproductive structure is called a microspore. It produces a microgametophyte, which is the male gamete, or basically the sperm. The female reproductive structure, or the megaspore. So we got the microspore and the megaspore, right? Sounds like bad guys in a movie. Produce the female gamete, or the megagametophyte, and then they fuse to form seeds up inside of this structure here. This is only done, this is the mature structure. That kind of looks like an immature structure there, but this is what catches the pollen in the wind, and then it turns into the cone. And you know, they live here in Florida. You can see them. I've got them. I got a pine tree growing just on the other side of my fence. Now, there are other parts of the plant, and to me, you know, I like to eat, so I like to think of plants in terms of what we can eat. So when I think of the fruiting bodies, I think of the fruits, okay? But we also eat the roots. So here are some roots. Now, you know, the function of the root is to hold the plant in place, and also to absorb nutrients out of the ground. To be clear, not to absorb energy. Energy comes from the leaves, where photosynthesis occurs. From the ground, you get nutrients such as fertilizer and kind of structures, nitrogen, phosphorus, comes out of the ground. And what happens is that dirt is made out of mostly decomposing other plant matter. So to some degree, these roots are kind of pulling energy from these decomposing plant matter to, not energy, dang it, I said it, I didn't mean to. They're pulling nutrients from the decomposing plant matter and pulling it up onto the plant. Now, to be clear, most of the plant, the structure of the plant here, when you look at a plant, most of that structure did not come from the ground. It pulled some water and some nutrients, but during the process of photosynthesis, plants, which are mostly made out of carbon, pulls the carbon from the air through the process called photosynthesis, and that's how they build their bodies. When you look at a big, huge oak tree, most of that did not come out of the ground. Yes, the water came out of the ground, and there's a lot of water. You take out the water, what's left? Almost all of the structure of that plant was pulled from the air. But roots will help hold the tree in place, hold the plant in place, and allow it to pull nutrients out of the ground. And even though a lot of it is not made out of the stuff that's pulled out of the ground, what is pulled out of the ground is crucial, which is why when you add fertilizer to a plant, it helps it to grow. It pulls nitrogen and oxygen out of the air. Well, nope, doesn't pull nitrogen out of the air. Or oxygen, sorry, I said that wrong. It pulls carbon out of the air. It pulls nitrogen out of the ground, right? So even though there's nitrogen, there's more nitrogen in the air than oxygen or carbon, but the plant can't get that nitrogen. It has to go through a process in the roots that involves a bacteria. The bacteria pulls two nitrogen atoms out of the air and sticks it together to create N2. It's called fixation. And then the plant can absorb that. The plant can't just get the nitrogen out of the air. So lots going on in the roots. Now you got three layers. You got the epidermis, the cortex, and the stele, right? The outer layer is the epidermis, and that's the root hair. It absorbs the water. The cortex is the middle layer that transports the absorbed substances, and the stele is the inner layer. It consists of other vascular tissues to do other things. Now we got two types of roots. We got a taproot and a fibrous root. Typically on plants called monocots, meaning they have only one cotyledon, right? They're monocotyledonous. They are a little bit more simple plants. They have bamboo, grass, bananas. They have these fibrous roots that go down into the ground. Nothing wrong with them, nothing different. It's not like it's just they only have the one cotyledon, and as a result, a couple of things happens inside of the plant, but mostly they have the fibrous roots, right? Now the dicots means the dicotyledons, meaning they have two cotyledons. These are things like most of the plants we eat, like carrots, sugar beets, things like that. They have a little bit more of a straight root that branches off, and in the case of a carrot, it's like a straight root, you know. Its leaves also become a little different because of the way the cotyledon, it has to do with the plant or the seed and all. Some plants show modifications of the roots depending on like where they live. Some plants grow in a very arid environment, which is dry and desert-like, so they have thick roots to store water. Mangroves, for example, are submerged in salt water, so they have specialized roots to supply oxygen to their submerged roots. Yes, plants need oxygen, okay? And they also have to have specialized structures to survive salt water. Some tropical trees, such as the banyan tree, have what we call adventitious roots, meaning they grow from the lower part of the stem to support the stem, and they go up and down, and it's crazy about how banyan trees grow. But you know, over time and over adaptations, you can get all these crazy shapes and modifications of your structures like your roots. So now we're talking about the stems, and yes, we eat the stems too. Celery is a stem, and theoretically, potatoes are parts of the stem. They are tubers, they're not the roots. Rhizomes are part of the root system, and we eat those, although I can't think of a good example right off the bat. You've got your bulbs like onions, they're part of the roots, and in fact the onions are the leaves, believe it or not. And then you got runners, and we don't really eat runners, but we eat plants that have runners. Alright, so these are all types of stems, and they are not roots, they're stems, and they perform a very important function. They help to transfer the food, or I'm sorry, the nutrients from the roots up to the rest of the plant, and also they take energy in the form of sugar that's produced in the leaves and push it back down to the rest of the roots. See, there's a two-way process, there's a two-way highway here. This is what the vascular tissue does, is it moves nutrients up and down through the structure of the plant. And this is the stem, it's in the middle, it's in between the roots and the leaves. And then of course when we think of plants, this is mostly what we think of are the leaves, because the leaves is where all the really crazy stuff happens. But leaves, of course we do eat leaves. We eat lettuce, we eat all kinds of leafy vegetables. But one of the things that the leaf will do, and this is amazing, and it is responsible for all life on Earth, to be honest with you, well, quite a bit of life on Earth, is sunlight will go in, and in the epidermis of the plant cells you get these cells that are specialized in absorbing sunlight and using the energy from the sunlight to rearrange the atoms in water and carbon dioxide molecules, I'm sorry, and rearrange those into sugar, and then they release oxygen. So carbon dioxide goes in from the air, water comes in from the roots, and these things will take that carbon dioxide and that water and like rearrange it, kind of like you're playing with Legos. You break apart and put them back together, and you create a sugar, and then what's left over is called oxygen. They throw that away. The plants also, the leaves also help in a process called transpiration I talked about earlier. As the water is pulled up from the roots, it gets to the very tip, and then as it evaporates, more water is pulled up, so it creates a constant flow of water from the roots all the way up to the leaves. And if you think about it, the largest living organism in the world is that tree out in California. It's hundreds of feet tall. How does water get from the roots up to the top of that tree? It's through this process called transpiration. Okay, there's a little bitty microscopic straw going all the way through those trees, bunches of them, and it helps to pull the water up. Water will literally climb up through those straws. And there's a video on transpiration in the calendar that I've linked you. So we're going to move on. There's some really different types of leaves that they've modified so much. I mean, one of the most modified leaves are the spines on a cactus. That's actually a leaf. It's so small and thin because it helps prevent water loss. And of course the sharp spines protect it. You've got your bracts. These are leaves that change color. They kind of look like flowers, but they're not. Poinsettias have this, but they do also act like flowers because they attract pollinators. Then you got cylindrical leaves, like these pitcher plants, and these are actually leaves, but they also trap insects and they digest them, which is crazy. So yeah. These are all different shapes of leaves other than what you normally see as a leaf. So leaves are also just like roots and just like stems. They're highly modified to accomplish a task. Believe it or not, plants can move. I know that seems weird, but they're not capable of much movement, but with the right stimulus they can change the way that they grow. Tropism is a plant's growth response to the sun, right? Well, anything really. Tropism is a response to anything, but like geotropism is a response to the gravity, so they know which way to grow up. Phototropism is a response to the sun. They grow towards the sun. You can actually have a negative stimulus in which they grow into something and they sense that, and the plant will start growing in another direction. That's called tropism, right? Hang on, I'm gonna find you a picture of tropism. Real simple experiment you can perform in a class. You can do this at the house if you like, but you know, you put a light source in a different spot and the plant will grow differently. This is called phototropism. It grows in response to the location of the light. So, just types of tropism. This is another example of phototropism. This is somebody's plant that was growing on a shelf, and it grew very much, instead of straight up, it grew towards the source of energy. It needs that energy, so it grows towards light. We've talked about gravitropism, this idea that plants, when you put a seed in the ground, you don't have to plant it a certain way. It can go in any way, and it'll start growing opposite of the gravity, because it knows that gravity is pulling down and it needs to grow up. There's the nastic response, which is it's not really tropism, but it is types of, well, I guess it is tropism. But the leaves open and close at night. There's some plants that'll do that. It helps to conserve heat, helps to conserve water. So we're going to take a few minutes and talk about how we are using plants. We eat plants, and we eat things that eat plants, and so plants are really important to humans. On top of that, the fact that the human population is growing tremendously, we've got to figure out how to feed the population of the earth. That when my grandmother was born in 1919, there were less than 2 billion people on the earth, and when she died a year ago at the age of 100, well, I guess a little over a year ago, at the age of 100, there were 7.5 billion people on the earth. She saw the population of the earth increase by almost 4 times, really. And by 2050, which really isn't that far away, we expect there to be 9 billion people on the earth, and every single one of them wants silly things like clean water and food. So how do we provide that? And plants are going to actually solve lots of our problems. One of the problems is that plants require space, so we've got to figure out how to grow more food in more land, and good land that is what we call arable. We've already used it all. We're already growing food on just about every square inch of arable land we've got. Now there are some protected spaces that we don't let grow on because we're trying to protect the ecosystem. Personally, I agree with that. But people are getting hungry, so we're growing more and more food, and we got to figure out how to grow more food per acre. We got to figure out how to grow better food and faster food. Another thing is the growing season. You may have great growing arable land in northern Canada, but it freezes half the year, so you can't grow food there all the time. So we have lots of challenges with growing food, plus the natural resources. To grow food, we do things like we contribute to greenhouse gases by producing fertilizers. When we cut down forests to grow food, it leads to deforestation. And of course, in a warming earth, we're having changes in weather. So places that used to be very fertile because they had a lot of rain, now they're experiencing record droughts, like Southern California, and it's affecting our ability to grow food. Fertilizers that we use in farming, and I come from a farming, ranching family. Fertilizers that we use in farming contain nitrous oxide. This is a greenhouse gas, and when we grow more plants on land, we are letting less of other native plants grow. We're also growing smaller plants where there may be larger plants, which means less carbon uptake, which means a greater chance of global warming. Now, these are things that we have to do because, you know what, I don't want the earth to warm, but I really don't want to starve to death. So we have to figure out how to, I guess, find a compromise, find a better way. Science will do this. Science will help us figure this out, I promise you. Okay? And so these are some troubles that we're facing, but I believe that science is capable of solving these problems. It may include that we have to change the way we do things. And I come from a beef ranching family, but for every cow that I raise and produce a pound of beef, I could have produced 10 pounds of grain, and I could have fed 10 times more people. So perhaps we have to raise less cows and more plants. I don't want to do that, but that may be where we have to go. We have water to consider how to conserve. Lots of issues to think about that. Okay? Plants are rather crucial to our life. So are fungus, really, because fungus represents the other end where they decompose. And fungus are great decomposers. They also provide us with food and other things. Studying these two kingdoms is very important to us. So go back and review one more time and get ready to take the mastery test. And good luck and get to work.